Okay, fine.
Fine. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You have come today to listen to another very interesting webinar organized by the Institute of Certified Management Accountants of Sri Lanka. This time, through this webinar, we are discussing the impact of Indian rupee convertibility on the economy. So, like earlier, we have here three veteran speakers. Of course, I must say our keynote speech will be delivered by Dr. W.A. Vijayavardhana, who is not a stranger to CMA Sri Lanka. Dr. Vijayavardhana will be joined by Mr. Shiran Fernando and also Mr. Jeevantha. I will give the detailed descriptions of the speakers little later, but to start the conference proceedings now, let me invite President of CMA Sri Lanka, its incumbent President, Professor Lakshmanar Vatavara. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruchira Perera, who is our council member and handling the webinar today. Let me also thank all our eminent speakers who are here with us. As Mr. Ruchira has mentioned, Dr. W.A. Vijayavardhana is there with us, Mr. Shiran Fernando and Mr. Jeevantha. And let me also welcome our council members and also all our participants who are present today. This is a different topic from what we have been handling earlier, because we were really looking at maybe the problems that we have had on the impact of the DDO was the last one, and before that on the depreciation of the currency and many other matters. So I think the this topic is also connected with the current problems and the various matters relating to the IMF proposals that we have gone through. So we have an eminent panel, and I'm sure that they will be able to tell you more of what is happening. But if you really look at the impact of the Indian rupee convertibility on the economy, I think our connections with India goes back to a long period of time, 2,600 years ago, with the advent of Buddhism to Sri Lanka. I think this was really the start. But on the convertibility of such a matter, I don't know whether they would have been discussing during those periods. But we know that currently we are in a very difficult situation. So as a result of this, I think India has come up with many proposals. I think the current visit of our Excellency, the President, to India has resulted in many new ideas that have come up from the Indian side. And I think a lot of them involved, including a bridge to maybe connect with Sri Lanka, the pipelines that are going to be done, many investments that are going to be done. And of course, the most important thing that they said is the Indian rupee convertibility, because tourism was one of the main areas that they were looking at. But I know that if you really look at this as professional accountants, we will see that you may have to do a SWOT analysis. I know all of you will be really looking at that, because we know the strengths that are there, the weaknesses that we have, the opportunities, and of course the threats. So these, I am sure, would be amply dealt with our eminent panel who are here, because Dr. Vijayavardhana, ex-central banker, so he will be able to speak on what sort of way that the central bank and the monetary authorities will be looking at. Shiran Fernando, as the chief economist of the Ceylon Chamber, what the business side will be, the importers, the exporters, the investments that will be coming in. So all there, and of course, Mr. Jeevantha from the banking side would be able to tell on the impact of the banking sector and also the experiences that we have had. So we are very fortunate to have a very eminent panel who will be able to tell us all about this. And I'm sure that with the panel discussion, we'll also be able to ask many questions from our speakers and also to take up the Q&A. Over to you, Ruchira.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for those opening remarks. Now, we would move into our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker today, as I have mentioned, is Dr. W.A. Vijayavardhana. Dr. Vijayavardhana He is a former deputy governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. He is an educationist, writer, columnist, and also a public speaker. Engaging himself in education management, currently he functions as the president of Business Management School, BMS, a government-approved non-state sector university in Sri Lanka. Also, he serves on the faculty study boards of both the University of Sri Jawaharlal and the Postgraduate Institute of Management. He disseminates his knowledge by writing a weekly column to Daily FT and serving as an adjunct faculty at Thailand-based Asian Institute of Technology, AIT. And also he is a visiting lecturer in both the University of Sri Jawaharlal and PIA. So, with much respect, I would now like to invite Dr. W.A. Vijayawardena to deliver his speech. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Rusira and Professor Vatawala. And this is a very timely topic for Sri Lankans here, because wherever I go, I find that many people are asking me the question whether Sri Lanka rupee will be replaced by the Indian rupee and whether there is any value for Sri Lanka rupee in the future. So there's a fear among Sri Lankan population that Sri Lanka rupee will be replaced by the Indian rupee, but that is not the case. The case is something different. The different is that, Sri Lanka rupee will not be replaced by the Indian rupee. For us to have it, Sri Lanka should become a part of India. I mean, India has 29 states, and Sri Lanka should be the 30th state in order to enable Indian rupee to have legal tender in Sri Lanka. But that's not the case. So Sri Lanka is a sovereign state, and therefore Sri Lanka has its own sovereign currency called Sri Lanka rupee. And Sri Lanka rupee will not be replaced by the Indian rupee in the near future, but probably it may happen in the future. We don't know. That is because Sri Lanka's present goal is to become a rich country by year 2048, as announced by the President Ranil Wickremesinghe. India also has a similar goal. India wants to become a rich country by year 2047, as announced by the Indian Prime Minister Modi. And therefore, both countries are following the same type of economic growth objectives. And as a result, probably within the next 25-year time period, we don't know whether Sri Lanka would become a partner in progress with India, and also Sri Lanka rupee can become, the Indian rupee can become legal tender in Sri Lanka. That we don't know. But right now, what has happened is something very small, on a very small scale, as announced by as clarified by the central bank in a recent press statement. What has actually happened is that the central bank has approved the Sri Lankan commercial banks to buy and sell Indian rupees as a part of the foreign exchange management in Sri Lanka. Because there are other currencies which are being accepted by the local banking sector, like the US dollar, euro, Australian dollar, New Zealand dollar, all kinds of currencies, including Thai baht. Now, to this list, Indian rupee has also been added by the central bank, so that commercial banks can buy and sell Indian rupee in Sri Lanka. This is exactly what has happened, and not the replacement of the Sri Lanka rupee with the Indian rupee. Now, in this particular model, what is happening is that whenever an Indian person comes to Sri Lanka, he doesn't have to exchange his Indian rupees for dollars and dollars back to Sri Lanka rupees. It will be straight away, he will bring Indian rupees, and he can sell Indian rupees to Sri Lanka, local bank, and get Sri Lanka rupees for expenditure in Sri Lanka. Similarly, Sri Lankans who are visiting India also can now take Indian rupees to with them, and they don't have to take dollars and then convert the dollars in India into Indian rupees. So this particular, the transmission mechanism has been now simplified. So nobody has to, have any exchange rate risk by first converting their money into dollars and then dollars back to Sri Lanka rupees, and Sri Lanka rupees to dollars and dollars back to Indian rupees. Because in the case of the banking sector, even though banking sector is a very, it's a very specific animal. Whenever we want to buy your trader, trader's job is to buy and sell, and what is happening in the trade is that they buy at a lower price and sell at a higher price. and the profit that they make in the transaction is their own income. But in the case of the banking sector, not necessarily the banks in Sri Lanka, the banks throughout the globe, in addition to this buying and selling rate, they are charging some commissions whenever a currency is being bought or sold by them. And as a result, it has become very expensive for people to exchange their own currencies into another currency, because in addition to the buying and selling rate differential, banks are making a profit by charging a commission from the customers also. Now, this commission is sometimes as high as 7 to 8% of the value of the transaction. So this is why in 2009, some people in USA had to introduce a cryptocurrency called Bitcoin in order to enable a peer-to-peer transaction without going through the banking system. Because in protest of the high charges made by banks from the customers, whenever they did transactions with banks, by way of the buying and selling rate differential plus the commission that they charge, the Bitcoin was introduced in order to do these transactions safely, and it became very popular as a medium of exchange as well as a speculative investment. Now, similar thing will happen in Sri Lanka also. What happens is that when you have Sri Lanka rupees and when you want to go to India, and if you buy dollars, you have to pay a commission to the bank. When you go to India and when you exchange those dollars into Indian rupees, you have to pay another commission to the banks in India. So this is double type of expenditure that people will have to incur. Now this has been eliminated. Simply you bring in Indian rupees and you convert them into Sri Lanka rupees, and Sri Lanka rupees can be converted into Indian rupees in India. But in between, there is trade. Now, what I was referring to was the flow of the people coming to Sri Lanka and flow of people going to India. In addition to that, we have a trade of goods, manufactured goods, visible goods with India. And India also has trade with Sri Lanka. And there, the present system is that the prices in Indian goods are quoted in dollars. Similarly, Sri Lankan goods are also quoted in dollars. And therefore, the buyers and sellers, the importers and exporters of those goods will have to necessarily convert their money into dollars and then dollars back to the respective Indian currency. So this is what is happening now. And for the trade to take place in the future, we will have a simplified system. The goods that are to be sold to Indians will be quoted in Sri Lanka rupees. For example, if you want to export coconut oil to India, instead of quoting it in terms of the US dollars, we will quote them in Sri Lanka rupees. And as a result, the buyers in India can buy them by using their Indian rupees. Similarly, the goods that are coming from India also will be quoted in Indian rupees. For example, if you want to bring a Maruti vehicle to Sri Lanka, the Maruti vehicle will be quoted in Indian rupees, and Sri Lankan people will be able to buy it by paying in Sri Lanka rupees and converting it into Indian rupees. So this will simply simplify the trade. Now, this simplification of trade is necessary at the present point in international trade also. That is because when you try to do trade with the US dollar, what would happen is that the dollar will become one of the scarce commodities in the world, and as a result, you will have to acquire dollars either by selling your goods and services in US dollars or by borrowing from the international markets, which is again a very risky and very expensive activity for any nation. Now, Sri Lanka has presently gone into this debt crisis because Sri Lanka doesn't have a surplus in the balance of payments. In order to fill the gap in the balance of payments, Sri Lanka had to borrow in US dollars to make the payments smoothly. And as a result, Sri Lanka had gone into this present debt crisis. Now, this can be avoided if we do the transaction directly with India. Now, India has become a very important trading partner, as Professor Vatawala had mentioned. Sri Lanka's largest importer is India now. It's about, close to 5 billion in 2020. The total goods that had come from India is about 4.7 billion, but it will pretty soon go up to 5 billion. And Sri Lanka's exports to India is also very large, but not so large as our exports to USA or EU or UK. It's about say close to about say 900 million US dollars, and Sri Lanka has a massive trade deficit with India. So as a result, in order to transfer all our exports and imports to Indian rupees, Sri Lanka has to borrow from Indian banks. So this is a very, again, we are coming back to this same situation which we have with the US dollar. Since there is a massive trade gap with India, amounting to about $3.5 billion US dollars per annum, Sri Lanka will have to acquire those dollars if it wants to convert all its imports and exports into Indian rupees. And that for that purpose, we will have to borrow from the Indian banks and also Indian sources. So that again will place Sri Lanka into a different kind of a debt crisis. The debt crisis is that since we don't have a balance in the balance of payments with India, our trade balance is a deficit with India. For Sri Lanka to pay in terms of Indian rupees, we'll have to acquire about say 5 billion worth of dollar worth of Indian rupees to make the payments. And out of that, the net amount will be about say 3.5 billion right now. So what it means is that the Sri Lanka will have to borrow from Indian banks, and the Indian banks will have to extend money to Sri Lanka. So we have, in addition to the present debt crisis, foreign debt crisis, we'll have a different kind of a debt crisis, because to pay whatever that we have borrowed from India, we don't earn enough Indian rupees by way of selling our goods or services. So this will, in the future, will lead to a different kind of foreign exchange crisis. But as it is, what I see is that the Sri Lankan authorities are bent on finding solutions for the immediate problems that Sri Lanka is facing. So in my view, what would happen is that Sri Lanka rupee will not be fully convertible to Indian rupee, because if we are to do that, we have to borrow from the Indian sources and acquire new debt from India and get into a different kind of a debt crisis. The second one is that the Sri Lanka rupee is a sovereign currency with legal tender. So as a result, it's not the Indian rupee that would replace Sri Lanka rupee. It will be used only for the very limited type of economic transactions like the tourism sector and as part of the import and export trade, not the entirety of the import and export trade. So with this, what is happening is we are actually replacing the US dollar or euro, any other convertible currency that we presently use in international transactions whenever we do transactions with India. And also Sri Lanka has this big problem because of the trade deficit with India. We don't have a surplus of Indian currency in Sri Lanka. And if we do have a surplus of Indian currency in Sri Lanka, again, it will lead to a problem. Now, as Professor Watawala mentioned, we had this problem when Sri Lanka became independent in 1948, because our currency board that was existent in Sri Lanka till 1950 had kept its foreign reserves in Indian rupees. And as a result, we actually, all our assets were in Indian rupees in Sri Lanka. But unilaterally in 1947, after India became independent, Jawaharlal Nehru, he introduced foreign exchange control. So as a result, we could not draw any of the money that we had held in our foreign exchange reserve, because India had imposed this foreign currency exchange controls to India without even consulting the countries which had been holding Indian rupees as their reserves. Because some of the countries, like not only Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and various other countries in the British Empire, they had been holding Indian rupees as their reserves. And all these countries actually came to a very it was a pathetic situation, and the finance minister Jayawardena and the first central bank governor John Exter had to visit India several times to get our money freed from the exchange control. And it is actually totally an unnecessary thing. So likewise, if we have a surplus of Indian rupees in our reserves today, with the current type of controls in India, India's capital account is not freed, it's not liberalized. It's only the current account which has been liberalized. So as a result, and also Indian Reserve Bank does not accept any so far it has not made this announcement. So far it has not made this policy change. Whenever a foreigner comes with an Indian rupee, it is not convertible into any convertible foreign exchange reserve currency in India. They will just simply replace it with another Indian currency. No. So because of this reason, it is a risky thing for Sri Lanka to carry a surplus reserve of Indian rupees also, because the Indian policies are not consistent. Its gold reserves are still not sufficient for India to make it currency convertible, because it has only about say about 600 tons of gold in its reserve. So because of this reason, the Sri Lanka cannot actually hold Indian currency as a part of the reserves of Sri Lanka, because it's a risky thing. So Sri Lanka will therefore continue to hold its reserves in dollars, euro, UK sterling pound, Japanese yen, all the convertible currencies in the world. And what is happening is that a trade facilitation, which has been done by Sri Lanka in consultation with Indian authorities to facilitate a smooth trading and tourism activity between the two countries. So as a result, nobody has to have any fear that Sri Lanka rupee will be replaced by an Indian rupee. And also it will not happen in the near future. If it happens in the long run, Sri Lanka will have to become the 30th state of India. And those are different political issues which Sri Lanka has to resolve. So presently what is happening is that we are actually bypassing the US dollar when we try to do a limited amount of transactions with India. So thank you very much, Ruchira. You can continue with your other part of the webinar now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vijayavardhana. Thank you very much, as usual, for clearly explaining what this concept is, why we have such a concept. I mean, you have mentioned clearly in your webinar. Now we have something like this because of the high cost which was involved in converting foreign currencies, especially now when it comes to the conversion of currencies between two countries. If it happened 2 times, you have mentioned that it would cost each country more, and of course, this has led to the development of cryptocurrencies sometimes back. Thank you very much for explaining the economic viewpoint of the Indian rupee convertibility on the domestic economy. Now I would like to move into the next speaker for the day, Mr. Shiran Fernando. Mr. Fernando, give me 1 second. Mr. Fernando is the Chief Economist at the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, and he leads the Economic Intelligence Unit, which is the focal point of the Chamber for Economic Research and Policy Advocacy. Mr. Fernando was previously a member of the Steering Committee on Economic Policy of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. He has previously held the role as the lead economist and senior product head at Frontier Research. He has been part of numerous economic and business forums, both locally and internationally, as a speaker, panelist, and as a moderator. Shiran is also contributing as a writer to LMD's monthly economic outlook column and an alumnus of the US International Visitor Leadership Program, IBLB. He is also a member of the investment advisory panel of the SoftLogic Investment and was recently appointed to the board of Biodiversity Sri Lanka and Petroleum Development Authority of Sri Lanka. Shiran holds a bachelor's in economics and finance from the University of London. He is a holder of the ACMA and CGMA professional qualifications, a postgraduate diploma in international relations from the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies, and he has an executive MBA from the PIM Sri Lanka. Mr. Fernando, over to you. We would like to know the view of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce on this.
Sure. Thanks, Richard, and thank you to Professor Vatavella and the CMA team for inviting me. Hope I'm audible. So I'll keep my remarks to broadly 4 areas, which is the overall theme I think Dr. Vijayavardhana alluded to, which is the de-dollarization theme and what that means for us in that sense. Then we'll talk a little bit about India and the role that it is expected to play in global trade, and I think that's a big opportunity for Sri Lanka. And then the bilateral relationship between Sri Lanka and India as well. and then get into really the business side of it in terms of what is expected from the use of the INR currency, what's the views and thinking on that. So if I'm to talk a little bit about the de-dollarization, I think this is a global debate that has been taking place for quite a while because as Dr. Vijayavardhan highlighted, the use of the dollar for trade and payment settlement does come with its own costs and concerns, and also the high dependency on it, and in particular when the global economy, the global geopolitical situation is quite fragmented. That also puts things in a difficult spot for countries that are trading with each other, and suddenly some of these countries might be under sanctions and so on and so forth. So I think there has been a global shift, in particular in the last few years, of certain countries coming up with their own currency, or at least using their own currency for trade settlement as well. And I think India, in that sense, has taken a global role in that. So we've seen India taking up close to about 18 countries or 19, and more recently with the UAE and with Malaysia in terms of using the INR as settlement. So it's not only Sri Lanka really that this phenomenon is happening, and I think that's the key point to echo to what Dr. Vijayavardhan has said, that it's not that the Sri Lankan rupee is suddenly going away. It's mainly the fact that the INR is now being used as a settlement currency in global trade. And it's not only a Sri Lankan phenomenon, it's happening with the UAE and even Malaysia, where the INR can be used to pay for trade and trade purposes. So that's, I think, an important thing to understand. And I think now begs the next question of where we're going to see from physical currency. Now we are seeing more digital currencies as well. And that really has an impact in terms of how monetary policy and the independence of central banks come into play as well. And I think you're seeing certain central banks like Singapore really looking positively towards digital currencies, simply from a trade transaction cost reduction, which is paramount for businesses, people, and of course SMEs as well. So I think that theme of de-dollarization is very important to understand and underscore as well. So with that theme, you're seeing kind of the role of India now coming into fruition. So if you look at who is the current chair of the global G20 bloc, which is the elite 20 countries in the world, that is right now chaired by India. If you look at where the growth of South Asia is coming from, or even the Asia Pacific coming from, the answer is India. The question of where a lot of investors, a lot of foreign companies that are looking to get into new manufacturing places, where can they set up, where is the scale? The answer to that again is India. So I think what you're now seeing, and there's a lot of positivity around it because of the fact that similar to Sri Lanka, which went through a crisis last year and still going through, India used its moment of crisis in 1991 to turn around the economy, to make it more open, to do a lot of the reforms that are required to make it a more connective economy. Of course, it's different states, different regimes. They've simplified certain taxes with GST, all of that over the years, and they've done a lot of other reforms related to investment. And now they're very much open towards trade and investment. So I think that's very important for Sri Lanka to realize, in particular the growth that has been seen in the electronic sector, that you're seeing now, for example, companies like Foxconn, which were predominantly either in Vietnam or China, some of these companies now, just from a geographical risk diversification point of view, setting up in India. So those have big implications for us as neighbors, and the different roles that we are part of. Of course, there is SAF, but beyond that, there's blocks like BIMSTEC, there's IORA, all of these different trading blocks, which will have an impact. So the question to ask, I think, is really in the next 5-10 years, if you do see the growth of India and the trade growth of India, and even the likes of World Trade Organization see the next 5 to 10 years, the trade growth or the export growth coming out of the second fastest block is going to be the South Asian region, driven a lot by India and, of course, Bangladesh. So being so close to this nation, I think it's high time for high integration. So that's I think where we were going in terms of the India story, India growth story, and can Sri Lanka latch on from that point of view. So from that, where is our bilateral relationship? I think that's a key point, and we recently saw the president making the visit to India and coming up with a vision. And I think the output from that was a vision document that has now been put out, and there were several key pillars to it. So some are around maritime connectivity, air connectivity, energy and power connectivity, trade, economic and financial connectivity, and people-to-people connectivity. So 5 broad areas, and you can see within the trade and economic and financial connectivity under point D, you can see the decision to designate INR as a currency for trade settlements between the two countries has forged strong and mutually beneficial commercial linkages and agreement to operationalize UPI-based digital payments for further enhancing trade and transactions between businesses and common people. So I think the vision and this document that is out there post the meetings, I think on the 21st of July, highlight all these connectivities really are coming through different pillars and platforms. And one of this is the realizationization of the INR as a designated currency. So that is, I think, moving forward. And I think even we've seen greater support as well from India in the last year, close to about $4 billion US dollars coming in various support form, either through swap facilities, through credit lines for fuel, for medicine and essential items. And a lot of those, as Dr. Vijayavardhana mentioned, will now, have to be, is not part of the restructuring of the debt perimeter, but those will have to be repaid in the next few years as well. So the interesting side of that will be if some of those can be settled in INR without it being dollar settlements, and if that kind of process will go towards that as well. So the overall economic trade connectivity is the crucial, will be a crucial pillar in this, in our bilateral relationship. So this brings me to the final area, which is really the business side of it. So if you look at it, if you look at the numbers clearly show that Sri Lanka is in a deficit from a trade and services point of view. So if you look at pure merchandise exports from Sri Lanka to India, we're looking at in 2022 close to about 860 million US dollars, hovers between 700 to 850 on a good year. Then if you're looking at imports, we're looking at a close to about 4.7 billion imports from India to Sri Lanka. So purely from a trade deficit point of view, if you just look at merchandise goods, it's about a 4 billion deficit. So where are we going to get the remaining? So I think the key answer to that is, of course, tourism, because I think it's India is one of the key markets for tourism, and maybe we won't be able to bridge the whole 4 billion, but some amount will be bridged if Indian tourists, for example, carry in INR. They come into our duty-free, spend in INR. They come into the hotels, they spend in INR. The hotels then collect it and then give it to the banks, and the banks build up their INR reserves, so that when the wholesaler or the trader in PETA, or from if it's another trader in terms of goods, wants to make an import payment, the bank now has INR in their reserves to help that transaction take place. So I think it needs to be broadly thought of in that way. And then, of course, I think the big component and the reason why we are in this debt situation is that we didn't attract enough export-led FDI. And India, I think, has close to about 3 billion in FDI that has come in beyond some of the loan arrangements that has come in over the last few decades. Can that increase much more? And I think that's the whole part of this connectivity arrangement, is to see whether we may not be as Dr. Vijayavardhana mentioned, we may not be a state, but can we become a Vietnam to a China? Okay, so can Sri Lanka become the Vietnam to India in that sense, or the Singapore to the Southeast Asian market? And that ties into my, the second point of India's growth. And I think that's where, if we do get more businesses from India coming in and investing, then you will see more Indian FDI coming in, and maybe some of those. I don't think at this stage investment is classified as a designated currency. Maybe that will happen subsequently, but that kind of also augurs well in terms of minimizing or reducing this deficit. And even this week, I must tell you, at the chamber, just now we finished a delegation of Indian businesses who've come in. Last evening, there was a big delegation coming in. Initially, they came in to explore investments in the north and the east, and then they made their way to the western province, and we had a function for them as well. So there is, at this point in time, a lot of interest generating out of the goodwill and the support that has happened last year, and then of course of the different diplomatic connectivity. Now you're seeing the business connectivity taking place. So I think it's high time to now convert some of this interest into real investment into sectors that really require FDI from Sri Lanka's standard point of view, because what we get from an IMF program and some of the reforms we are doing will stabilize only the economy, and for the growth to take place and for us not to return back to an 18 program with the IMF, we will require much more exports, both goods and services, and of course FDI that supports this rather than it going to non-tradable goods as well. So that's how we kind of bridge the deficit. But I think we need to also look at the adoption of it. I think that's the key part of it. That's the key chicken and egg situation here. Can those who are importing, I think a lot of food and vegetables get imported from India, a lot of raw materials. I think the apparel industry does import some amount as well. So all of these imports can both the exporting side from on the Indian side, are they going to be comfortable in this new arrangement, or are they still comfortable in transacting with dollars? So I think that mindset shift is the key to unlock this convertibility factor. And I think our next speaker will kind of talk much more in depth of the ground reality of it. But I think that's the key thing. If we're able to see greater acceptance, greater rates, better spreads, reduction in transaction costs, some key success stories from companies that are able to do it, I think then success will build success, and this convertibility will continue as well. So I think that's the key part. But I think the interesting phenomenon will be oftentimes as an economist, as a macroeconomist, I usually give a forecast on the currency to the USD. I think while that will obviously that dynamic will continue, we'll see now a more vibrant INR to a LKR, which might need forecasts and businesses might get more interested in. So I think that will be a new dynamic and phenomenon because of if you do see that shift in transaction and the volumes coming into the INR. So in that sense, if the INR gets adopted much more and we're able to bridge the deficit, then the pressure on having dollars for meeting either imports and some of these requirements will reduce. So that reduces some of the dollar rupee USD LKR pressure, but that creates a new phenomenon for the INR LKR, which will be interesting. So let me pause there and just to highlight what I just said. I think it's important to understand this conversation in terms of what's going on globally, which is the de-dollarization conversation. And India is a key part of it. And India's now emerging role in global growth and trade and what it means for Sri Lanka. Our bilateral relationship, which has, I think, got strengthened in the last 12 to 18 months. The new vision statement that is there as well. And then what I mentioned from a business side point of view, if you look at it purely from the merchandise trade deficit, of course, it's a significant deficit, but we need to have tourism and other services, maritime in particular. I mean, the Colombo port is one of the best ports and one of the most functioning ports because it's servicing transshipment towards the Indian market as well. So that's another service pillar that can that if it does shift into INR, for example, can bring these bridge deficits. And then the key crucial factor is the acceptance side of it. And if all this take place, then really the crucial thing will be how then the INR LKR will move. and the implications for the USD LKR with less pressure coming in from imports. So let me pause there and very happy to take questions later on. Back to you, Ruchira.
Thank you very much, Shiran. Thank you once again for expressing your views. Especially I admire those views coming from you representing the business sector from Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. As you have mentioned, yes, we can take up questions from the audience a little later. At this moment, before I move to the next speaker, let me tell you, if you have any questions, now I can see some questions have popped up under Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can, of course, direct questions in the Q&A. We can take up these questions during the Q&A session. So our next speaker is Mr. R.M.N. Jeevantha. He is the Deputy General Manager, International Treasury and Investment. He has over 20 years in International Treasury and Investment of Bank of Ceylon. He has over 20 years of banking experience in the areas of treasury management, investment banking, financial management, credit management, and retail banking. Ms. Jeevantha holds a BSc Special Degree in Accountancy from the University of Sri Chavadhanapura. He also has an MBA from the Postgraduate Institute of Management, PIM. He is a member of the Institute of Certified Professional Managers of Sri Lanka and associated member of Institute of Bankers of Sri Lanka. Ms. Jeevantha, we would like to know from you the banking sector viewpoint or the banking sector perspective on this episode. Over to you.
Thank you, Ruchira. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Professor Lakshman Vatawala, for having me. And I would like to do some small presentation on this.
I think you want to share the screen with Jeevantha.
Yeah, please, Ruchira, can you share?
I think, Tarindu, if you are there, I think Ms. Jeevantha can share the screen. Am I right? Jeevantha, just try whether you can share the screen, or if not,
Yeah.
if you can send the presentation to me, I can share my screen.
All right, okay. Okay, Ruchira, so I'll start the presentation while they're sending the
Fine. Okay.
presentation. The only thing we know that India and Sri Lanka have a very good relationship over the years and very vibrant and growing economic relationship over the years. And also we know that in 2021, India was the largest trading partner in Sri Lanka, having more than $5 billion amount. So that is a significant amount. And also we know that large number of Indian travelers tour into Sri Lanka annually. And you know that now this Indian currency treated or approved by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka as designated currency, we have been using ACU mechanism to do any transaction, the settlement of trade transaction between India and Sri Lanka. And there were many deficiencies having this ACU mechanism. Basically, is when you are doing ACU mechanism, there are three currencies involvement: Indian rupees, LKR, and dollar. So there will be difficulties for the importer and exporter also to make this settlement procedure. And also when we are doing the trade settlement transaction under this ACU mechanism, it's very difficult to do same day settlement because prior day funding is required. So basically, when you're doing a transaction today, you can't execute transaction today. Then you have to pre-fund it. At least you're doing transaction yesterday or day before yesterday, you have to do the funding to your Nostro accounts. But under this Indian rupee transaction, direct transaction, we don't see something similar, something difficulties we face under ACU mechanism. Now I have the presentation. I think you can see Ruchir, right?
Yeah, we can see the presentation.
Yeah. And also the pricing. Now pricing also very challenging. Why the dollar is also involving, and when you are having a LKR and INR, so the dollar fluctuation also embedded into the pricing. And transaction cost also quite high rather than, so we have to use the US platforms, US banks for the settlement of this transaction rather than doing Indian and LKR directly. And we know that recent past, India has become a economic giant and the 5th largest economy in the world. And we know that many countries are using INR currency. And RBI, they have given approval, 18 countries to use this INR as their trade transaction. And 35 countries, we know that given their consent to use INR as designated currency, or rather trading currency. And early stage also, we have seen that INR currency has used many transactions, but recent past, we have not done many things after this globalization. And I have put some INR LKR chart for the benefit of viewers. And there's a slight INR rupee depreciation and LKR depreciation. So generally, we are paying little higher than the LKR amount is little higher when you are having INR amount. So this is the USD INR, and we have not seen much depreciation in INR over the years, and 2 to 3% dollar depreciation we have seen. So basically it means that INR is a very stable currency against dollar. And last year, August 26th, the central bank has given consent, central bank has given approval to have INR as designated currency. You know, we have, as very correctly Doctor said, we have 16 designated currency at the moment. So this is the INR is the latest addition to this. And we have seen some many advantages by using INR as a trading currency. So it's a 24/7 settlement. Now, India, we know that even weekends also you can do transaction in India. And there is no much cost involvement, very minimal cost involvement. So the India RTGS transaction, Indian rupee to dollar transaction, or Indian rupees to Indian rupee transaction is very cost-effective transactions. And also the traders, especially if you take Sri Lanka, we are actually import-oriented country. We are doing large part of imports from India. And when Indian currency is used as trading currency for the settlement currency, we can derive these kind of benefits for our importers. So basically, since INR is when you invoice your export, especially the import exporters doing their invoices in INR, there is no cost involving in US dollar conversion. So directly they can invoice their export to Sri Lanka or wherever INR currency. So the invoice is coming in INR. So the very cost effective, and they can have the better pricing. And also there won't be any settlement delays. So when you are using ACU mechanism, or when you are using dollar settlement, then it has to go through New York and come back to the India. But when you're using direct LKR INR currency, it's only Sri Lanka to India. So the very cost effective, and plus also there is no any settlement delays we have seen. So very much important for the importer, Sri Lanka, and exporter in India to have this transaction quickly rather than using ACU mechanism. And also we have seen some Sri Lankan importers. So they can actually open their imports, they can open their LCs in INR. And also they can do some TT payment, telegraphic transfer payments in INR. Now Sri Lankan banks, after central bank has given the INR as designated currency, many banks have opened their Nostro accounts with Indian counterparts. Now, large banks, especially, they have already opened their Nostros with Indian counterparts, and Sri Lankan banks are now actually executing trade transaction with INR and LKR. So there is no much involvement in dollar transaction at the moment. But I'll tell you the reason why this is not happening very much. And also the better pricing, as I told you previously also, Indian exporter can invoice their exports in INR itself. So they know their cost, they know their margin. So there is no any currency involvement. They can actually avoid, they can actually minimize the dollar fluctuating when they are invoice their export to Sri Lanka. And also the fewer Nostro charges. So when we know that when you're using the dollar mechanism, so the SU mechanism or the New York mechanism through the US banks, there is a corresponding charge, or the bank charges are involved, little higher charges export importer has to pay. But by using direct INR LKR currency settlement, we can avoid this transaction largely. So that basically it's a very significant amount of charges can be avoided. And also we have seen some difficulties, rather deficiencies in having INR trade transaction recently. Now, when you want to execute this trade transaction, INR and LKR, so the Sri Lankan banks have to open special nostro account with Indian counterparts. Now we know that not like other currencies opening a nostro account, but when you're opening an Indian INR nostro accounts, you'll have to get the special approval from the RBI as well. So it's very stringent procedure. Still, the local banks, Sri Lankan banks, have to follow. And also, we have seen that this INR transaction are confined or the limited to trade transaction only. So basically, you can do import and export transaction only by using INR. And also, as Dr. very correctly said, anybody who is traveling from India, they can carry INR. That is their reported currency, and they can encash into LKR at the Bandar Naik International Airport. We have many counters, bank counters there. They can actually encash their INR into local currency. So that facility has been given. But the trade transaction, of course, confined to only import and export transaction only by using INR currency at the moment. So banks or the importer can open business foreign currency account with local banks, but they can't open fixed deposit or savings deposit still. They can't do that, but only for the trade. So to facilitate the trade transaction, they can open business foreign currency account to execute this transaction. And we are expecting that with the approval of the central bank or the other regulatories, so that this will enhance, this will basically expand the INR currency by using the other transaction also. Just to use this INR especially the importers are not importers are like to get their invoices in dollars, and also the Indian exporters are willing to invoice their export invoices in dollar terms as well. So basically they can get the dollar depreciation for the Indian exporter. But we have not seen much transaction recent past doing this by using this INR as a designated currency or the trading currency. But we think that even our PETA customers, the largest importers are happening in the PETA market from India. So we actually educate them to use INR currency as a trading currency. And also, as now, when you are coming, when the Indian traveler comes to Sri Lanka, so the bank counters are there at the international Bandar Naik International Airport to accept this Indian currency. So basically, Indian traveler is given the LKR for them to spend here in Sri Lanka. But when you have this, when the banks have this Indian currency, so basically they can utilize this currency only to the people who are traveling to India. So otherwise, if there is any excess at the moment, they can export into Singapore and get the dollars there to their nostros. So the excess dollars, of course, you can't do anything. But we are suggesting at least have this, there are many banks in Sri Lanka, Indian bank, at least to get this excess INR and give to the local banks to domestic currency, which is LKR. It has not been yet to basically, it has been basically negotiating with them, and we have also had a discussion with some Indian banks whether they can accept this Indian currency, but rather than be exporting excess to Singapore. And also we have seen some recent visit to President, and he has signed, the two countries have signed 5 MOUs, and we think that there will be a much popularity in Indian rupees as a designated currency, for the trading transaction. So we have many advantages, especially the importers in Sri Lanka has many advantages when they get the invoice in Indian rupees for their imports. Basically, Indian exporter has to invoice their export proceeds, export invoices in INR. Otherwise, very difficult for the local banks to pay for the use this recent designated currency, which is INR, for the trade settlement transactions. So we have seen many transactions after the introduction of this last year, August. Many transactions some banks have done through by using INR for the settlement of import transaction. But we have seen over the last few months, we have seen a reduction in INR settlement in trade transaction also. But we expect that for us to get especially the Sri Lankan importers to get the benefit, Indian exporters also have to take some action to invoice their invoices in INR. And also, I would like to mention that even the local banks open their nostros with Indian counterparts. Obviously, they'll have to do some nostro funding. So basically, initially, at the initial stage, they'll have to use dollars, then get the Indian rupees to fund their nostros balances. So that at the moment, we don't see much exports to Sri Lanka. We have not seen much export from India to Sri Lanka. Sorry, much export from Sri Lanka to India. So very, very reluctantly, we are getting Indian rupees as a inflows to Sri Lanka. So only the inflows to Sri Lanka is through Indian travelers by hard currencies. So once we do some export to India in a big way, so then there will be an Indian, if our exporter willing to take Indian currency, Indian payments, then we'll have a easily fund these nostro balances. So at the moment we are having little difficulties, but we can manage. All the banks have managed the difficult situation also, and all the banks in Sri Lanka are accepting now Indian trade transaction settlement also. Thank you, Ruchira.
Thank you very much, Ms. Devanta, for that very comprehensive presentation. So now we can move to the Q&A session. So before I hand over to moderator, let me tell you now there are about 12 questions which have come up on Q&A. But I'm glad to see Dr. Vijayavardhan has answered most of the questions. Thank you, sir. At the outset, I must thank you. And let me now invite Professor Vattawala to moderate the session.
Let me thank all our speakers. I think they have really given very valuable information. And also, some of these things may have not been known by maybe our professionals and also the business community. One main question I have, I think where maybe Professor Vijayavardhan would be able to answer, is you see, now we have an arrangement with the IMF. Now, this particular arrangement that we are having with the IMF, with this acceptance of the Indian currency, I would like to ask you, what is the sort of impact it will have in the maybe the repayment that we are going to talk, which is mainly in the US dollars, how this would really impact and help us in this area?
Yes, Professor Vattawala, now since Indian currency is not a recognized international reserve currency, any acquisition by Sri Lankan banks by way of borrowing from Indian sources or by having a surplus trade with India and adding that to the country's national reserves will not be accepted by IMF for the purpose of calculating the building up of the gross reserves of the country. So therefore, it's completely out. What is happening here is that we are facilitating trade, as Jivanta has very correctly presented here. We are facilitating trade with India, and India has become our largest trading partner. Of course, we are running a huge trade deficit with India now, and that deficit can be actually filled by having a surplus in the services sector. If, for example, more tourists come to Sri Lanka than the tourists going to India, and also if they spend more money in Sri Lanka, the trade deficit of $3.5 billion can be balanced by selling more services. But unfortunately, the services like education and healthcare services, still Sri Lankans prefer to go to India rather than Indians coming to Sri Lanka. For that purpose, what should be done is that we, Sri Lanka, will have to, our universities will have to get affiliated with the Indian universities of repute, like the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras, in Chennai, and Bombay, and all these institutions will have to set up branches in Sri Lanka, which is actually a non-event right now as far as Sri Lanka's education sector is concerned. Healthcare services also, the Indian healthcare services are much more advanced than the services that we offer. Therefore, Sri Lankan people will prefer to go to India to obtain these healthcare services rather than Indian people coming to Sri Lanka. So because of these reasons, even though we have partly opened up Sri Lanka's, acceptance of foreign currencies by our banks, I'm actually emphasizing the word our banks because it's not a part of the central bank's thing. It's not a part of the country's foreign reserves because Indian rupee is not an international reserve currency. So therefore, even if we have Indian rupees in our stock of currencies held by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, it is worthless because what we can do is our central bank cannot repatriate that Indian currency to the Reserve Bank of India and get paid in another convertible currency. All we can do is we can sell it to a local bank like Bank of Ceylon if they have a shortage of Indian rupees, and that actually facilitates only the trade transactions with India. So in my view, the present bailout package that we have with IMF is not relevant to this particular opening up which central bank and Indian government, Sri Lanka government have done with Indian government and the Reserve Bank of India.
Thank you. Shiran and Jivanta, if you have any comments.
No, I mean, I echo what Professor Dr. Vijayavardhan is saying in the sense it doesn't help us in the short term of both repaying back the IMF post the loan and also our restructuring, because the restructuring is of our dollar debt, which I don't think our creditors, both bilateral and multilateral, as well as the bondholders will, want INR in that sense. But what if we do improve the amount of transactions that happen in INR, and if we develop some level of surplus that can be used for import in that imports that we get in dollars, then that kind of reduces the need for dollar liquidity to pay for a lot of these imports, because India is the biggest import partner. So that in a sense kind of reduces the pressure on the currency and in turn on reserves as well. So indirectly it will help, but it has to gain scale to have an impact. But in the short term on the restructuring and IMF, it doesn't really have an impact.
Jivanta, you have any comments on that?
I fully endorse what doctor said. Of course, yes, our entire portfolio in our debt or whatever they're doing in dollar terms. But as we discussed previously, also as long as we are getting more export to India, when we're having an Indian currency import to Sri Lanka, so then we'll be actually basically having this negative impact to our currency inflows.
Yeah. Now, one of the main factors that came up is that we are really in a deficit situation with India as far as the currency is concerned, but we are now trying to increase it mainly by the tourism sector. And also, so as a result of this, now what will happen is now, since we are a net importer, would that mean that we still will have to convert our dollars to buy the Indian rupees, or is there a special facility that will be granted by India which will help us to save the dollars? I think either Dr. Vijayavardhan, maybe first you can, and then the others can follow you.
I couldn't follow your question, Professor Vatavala. What did you say?
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is now we are in a net deficit situation, no? Because we are not having surplus Indian rupees. So what I'm asking is, as a result of this, now with this convertibility that we are having, will we be able to maybe, as said, borrow from the Indian banks? Otherwise, we will have to convert dollars to then generate the Indian rupees that we require.
Yeah, Professor Vatavala, so far the central bank has not opened up this particular type of transactions for Sri Lankan companies and people. it has opened it up only for banks like Bank of Ceylon. Bank of Ceylon can borrow from Indian sources and build up a reserve. So far, our exchange control, we have now new Foreign Exchange Act. Our exchange control does not permit Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka has so far not opened up its capital account, even with India. So if we are to borrow as persons and as businesses from Indian sources, we have to get the approval from the central bank to do so. And that part has so far not been opened up. And I'm sure that Sri Lanka will not do it in the near future because of the shortage of, foreign exchange and our getting into a different type of indebtedness, foreign debt indebtedness, until we have resolved the current external debt problem in Sri Lanka, and until we have a very safe position with respect to our balance of payments, I don't think central bank will permit us to borrow from Indian sources and keep that money in an account. But what we can do is get the banks, because now the crucial issue is when a customer goes to a bank and asks for Indian rupees, and if that bank does not have Indian rupees, it can actually buy Indian rupees from another bank. If that another bank also does not have Indian rupees, as Jeevant has very correctly said, we'll have to borrow from an Indian source, from our correspondent banks in India. And for that purpose, the central bank has permitted local banks to do so. But it has not been permitted in the case of the individuals and businesses in Sri Lanka so far. Eventually, once Sri Lanka's foreign exchange situation becomes very comfortable, Sri Lankan Central Bank might permit us to borrow from India without its approval. Right now, yes, we can do it with the approval of the central bank.
Jivanta, can you add to that, because whether you are able to borrow from Indian rupees?
Professor, actually, as I explained in my presentation, also initial transaction, when you're initiating the INR transaction for the trade settlement, initially you have to use the dollar currency and get the Indian currency to nostros. So as long as if you don't have Indian reserves here in Sri Lanka, as very correctly said the doctor, we can't use Indian currencies for nostros. So if the government gets at least inflows to the government and they give us, the banking sector is given this, whatever the portion in Indian INR currency, then we can actually park into the nostro and we can use our import settlement, this nostro balances. Otherwise, until we get the sufficient inflows in INR terms, of course, we have to use INR, US dollar currency and convert, and we have to credit into our nostro accounts to INR.
No, that's why what I'm asking is, now you see, that is then that there is no advantage for us, no. But can you borrow, will the Indian banks lend to you in which you can use in your nostro account?
At the moment, central bank has given to utilize this or to use this INR as a trade settlement facility only. So they have not allowed banks to borrow in INR. At the moment, we are actually borrowing from US dollar terms only.
Right. So actually, Dr. Vijayawardena, there is no benefit coming to us.
Well, not immediate benefit, but what happens is that, since India is our big brother, Professor Vattawala, if we do, all our economic transactions with big brother in good faith, India also has to do it in good faith with Sri Lanka. We may build up a close economic collaboration with India. Now we are trying to sign a new agreement, replace the present Indo-Sri Lanka free trade agreement with the comprehensive economic partnership agreement with India now. And once we do this type of economic collaboration activities with India, probably the present, liberalization might help us to, expand those activities. So this is a beginning, but not the end.
It will take some time.
Yeah.
But one of the questions that I want to ask, I think, especially on the those who are exporting from India, you see, if they give the invoice in US dollars, which may be something that is preferable to them, then what will be our situation? Then we are not going to get any gain. Is that, do you think that that would maybe initially it may be there, but later that it might be changed to Indian rupees?
Yeah, I mean, in India now, the businesses have been permitted to keep their external balances outside India in dollars or any other convertible foreign currency. So as a result, they might prefer, the large business I'm referring to, the pharmaceutical companies, the companies that, export, transport equipment to Sri Lanka, they might prefer getting paid in US dollars rather than in Indian rupees. Only that part of money that is to be converted to Indian rupees to meet their local expenses, of course, there is a demand for getting paid in Indian rupees. So that's why I said the present liberalization initiative by Sri Lanka will help us to do only a limited amount of trade transactions. Plus, as Jivanta has very correctly said, the tourists can always, bring in Indian rupees and convert them into Sri Lanka rupees through banks, not through the shop, because somebody had asked this question, whether our shops can accept Indian rupees. If we do so, then actually we are partially making Indian rupee also a legal tender in Sri Lanka, which is not being done by the central bank right now. And central bank press statement has very clearly said it has not been approved, but in the future it can happen. Because the shops can accept, unofficially the Indian rupees and then, have trading arrangement with their respective banks and sell the the Indian rupees that they collect to the banks, so that the banks also will be able to build up their Indian rupee reserves. That can happen in the future, but not immediately.
Shiran, one of the questions you see, I think if the Indian rupee is liberalized, it will really be, the importers will try to really maximize their imports from India. Do you think that that sort of thing will happen, or the exporters will be also benefited?
Importers from Sri Lanka,
Yeah, those who are importing from India.
India. No, so for them to take advantage of it, or for them to make benefit of it, there has to be enough INR in the banks, right? So that's where the whole collection of INR by the banks, either through tourism or different services, need to come in. And for it to make sense for them, they have to get a better rate and see transaction cost reducing. So that goes back to the point of adoption.
So do you think that initially for this scheme to be successful, India will have to maybe give a loan to Sri Lanka in Indian rupees, which will really then promote the use of Indian currency?
I mean, they've given us swap facilities, but it's in dollar terms, which we need to now pay back. I don't know whether they'll give us more in the current situation, but maybe some of these things can be explored after the restructuring and all of that is discussed.
Professor Vattawala, we have another problem, because now Jivanta was telling about this ACU arrangement. In the ACU arrangement, we always had the net deficit with India, and every 2 months' time we'll have to settle it with US dollars. But since December 2021, we had got arrangements with Indian Reserve Bank and also Indian government to postpone the payment. Initially, it was just 500 million US dollars, but now it has gone up to some 2.3 billion US dollars. So you will see now, if the Indian now Reserve Bank of India or any other source in India, like the State Bank of India, should grant any loan to Sri Lanka in Indian rupees, it should be massive amount. Maybe about say 5 billion US dollar worth of Indian rupees they have to lend to us. First, we have to settle the ACU payment, and then we'll have to use the excess cash that we have for facilitating these transactions. So that is a totally, unacceptable thing, Professor Vattawala, because, you can, if you can borrow in US dollars, you can do the same thing, rather than paying interest to an Indian bank to borrow 5 billion.
Yeah. Now, one of our main export earnings, especially in the Colombo port, that is the transit traffic. Now, supposing if we are going to accept in Indian rupees, don't you think that we are really going to have a big problem on our US dollar repayments?
Yes, of course, what would happen is to that extent, partially we have a shortage of US dollars, partially. But with respect to the, transaction that we do with India, we will have the Indian rupees. But since we are running a trade deficit with India, amounting to some 3.5 billion right now, which will soon go up to 4 to 5 billion in the near future, part of that money that we earn by way of Indian rupees can be used to finance the imports from India. But our main focus today should be to, as you say, to settle our debt in US dollars. For that purpose, we have to acquire US dollars. Since Sri Lanka is not in a position to borrow from the commercial markets immediately because of the problem of the foreign debt restructuring, which is still hanging on us. And therefore, there is no any possibility for Sri Lanka to acquire US dollars in the near future. Now, even Mr. Jivanta has said that he has to first borrow from US dollars and then convert them to Indian rupees to maintain this nostro account, which is again, we are doing the same thing. We are doing the same thing, borrow from US dollars and keep in our nostro account. And the nostro accounts will be used to do transactions with India. So it will actually be a double cost.
Iran, now I think one of the biggest benefits that we are expecting is from the tourism sector. How do you think that we will really have a very high growth in the tourism sector?
I think we're seeing a little bit of a bounce back, and hopefully the winter season coming up will be better. I think the Indian tourism is what can keep, whether it's off-peak or winter season or whatever during the year, I think it can be quite steady. And I think the recovery we've seen so far has also been fueled by a lot of tourists from India and, of course, Russia and that side as well. But I think realistically, probably 2024 or 2025 is when we're really going to see a full bounce back of the tourism market, and then with it, the likes of India, China coming back in to what it was in 2018. I think our reference here now is the good times for the tourism industry is 2018, because since then it's been pretty bad. So it'll be a while away, I think.
Jivanta, now you see one of our main foreign exchange earnings are in the remittances that are coming into the country. But of course, most of them are in the Middle Eastern and other countries. But supposing if we permit this Indian, now they said that UAE, they are permitting Indian currency. Would there be a situation that they will start remitting in Indian rupees?
Professor, actually, we have not seen similar trends so far, but even our expectations are working in Middle East countries, they are actually not earning in dollar terms. Sometimes they're actually earning in their local currencies, but still they're remitting to Sri Lanka. So ultimately Sri Lanka gets in dollar terms. So basically there are exchange houses and banks there in those countries, and basically they accept their local currency and they actually send to Sri Lanka through banking sector dollar terms. But only thing, as long as we are receiving Indian rupees from abroad also, we'll have to either find out the utilization of these Indian rupees. At the moment, there is no banking sector in Sri Lanka for us to place INR in anywhere. So basically, whatever the INR balances, we'll have to use people who are traveling abroad to basically to India only. So at the moment, this placement facility has not been activated. So we are expecting in the near future also it will be activated. But still, preferable currency is dollar terms. So basically our debt is everything is basically happening dollar terms. So I don't think that there'll be a much popularity even we receive INR currency to Sri Lanka from expatriates.
Thank you. Shiran, you mentioned that we can be a Vietnam to India or a Singapore to Southeast Asia. Can you elaborate on those, what you mentioned about that?
Sure. So I think if you look at the Vietnam story, I think everyone talks about it right now, but it was actually a 20 years worth of reform. And this thing, if you look at their political structure, it's totally different to their economic structure. So it's a, one-party communism in that sense, and you have a very capitalistic economic model. And I think from mid 2000s till they did a lot of ease of doing business related reforms, making it easier for companies to set up in their zones, plug and play, all the infrastructure is there. Then from I think 2010 onwards, they've done all the free trade agreements, done the market access. So it has been a 15 to 20-year journey for them to now be able to take some of these companies who come to China, if they want to, not if they're having 5 factories in China, maybe have one or 2 factories in Vietnam. I think that's been their big benefit, and of course apparel and some of these other industries. So Sri Lanka's opportunity in that sense is the center of growth in terms of trade is now shifting from is shifting from China and coming more towards this region in particular, to be dominated by India as well as Bangladesh as well. And you're seeing those early signs. Foxconn, so many other big suppliers who predominantly were in India based are now coming into who predominantly were China based coming into India. So in that grand scale of things, for example, if we deepen our free trade agreement with India to kind of iron out some of the issues that we have, I think we want to go on the line towards RCEP, which is a block of 15 countries, integrating more with Southeast Asia. So I think the vision is correct in that sense to latch onto it, but we need to do more of the reforms that Vietnam did in the late 2000s that enable them to be where they are now. So we are seeing a lot of them. We're seeing a lot of labor reform right now taking place, very ambitious to harmonize a lot of the different labor laws that we have into one. There's a lot of talk on the tariff reform that will help as well. Then we're seeing a lot of our state-owned enterprises, certain reform taking place. There are more competition being introduced to certain sectors, which were maybe government monopolies as well. So we're heading in that direction, but it needs to accelerate if we are to latch on to India's growth. And I mean, the Singapore example is a good example of a country that has no real resources on its own. But if you look at one of the biggest exports coming out of Singapore is oil. Why is that? Because they import it from either Malaysia or Indonesia or from the region, and they re-export it. They have the refinery, all of that within the port, so everything is connected, and then they re-export it. So I think that's our big opportunity to be that re-exporter of oil, to service ships that go towards India, that bypass Sri Lanka and go towards Singapore and get service. So that's really our opportunity. That has always been our opportunity, and this crisis can hopefully enable that direction to go ahead.
Dr. Vijayvarna, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, now our relationship with India is not limited to the current trade transaction that we do it in, because we are expecting to build up this comprehensive economic partnership relationship with India, in which Sri Lanka will be a part of the Indian supply chain network. And if it happens, the goods that we import, the inputs that we import from India can be priced in Indian rupees. And also what we supply to the Indian assembling plants by way of the parts that we manufacture in Sri Lanka can be priced in Indian rupees. And therefore, it is just like, local trader buying in Sri Lanka rupees and then selling in Sri Lanka rupees. So he will be avoiding the necessity to maintain a different account in another currency. So what would happen is that in the future, if we can establish this large relationship, that's why I said India is going to become a rich country by 2047, when it celebrates the centenary of independence from Britain. Sri Lanka is also going to become a rich country by 2048, when Sri Lanka celebrates the centenary of independence from Britain. So if both countries can get together and move forward together, Professor Vattawala, it will be to the advantage of Sri Lanka. And in that sense, I don't advocate it right now, but in the future, I see the possibility of Sri Lanka becoming at least a part of the economic zone of India, or even the 30th state of India. That can happen within the next 25-year time period.
This one of the questions, you see, the consumers are today very much worried about the high prices. Now, especially the food and vegetables, I think, Shiran, you also mentioned that. Now, with this acceptance of the Indian or the Indian currency or the convertibility, do you think that it is really going to benefit our consumers as far as prices are concerned, especially maybe the food, vegetables, maybe the pharmaceuticals, and very many items that are there? Would there really be a benefit to the consumer? Dr. Vijayavardhan, maybe first you, then maybe Shiran and others.
Well, as consumers, Professor Vattawala, we are consuming a wide range of products that are being manufactured in India. Starting from, say, even the simple toothpaste to toothbrush to the large items that like, transport equipment we consume, we have the origin from India. And when we do so, our basic issue that we face here with this Indian rupee convertibility is that we must have a sufficient reserve in Indian currency with our banks. Right now, as Jivanta has said, central bank has not permitted local banks to borrow from Indian sources. Right now, what is being done is that we are facilitating the use of Indian rupees by borrowing in US dollars and then converting those US dollars into our Nostro account in Indian rupees, and that is what is being done. So unless we become a part of Indian system or Indian state, this particular problem will continue to loom over us. We cannot resolve it right now.
Shiran, your comments, please.
I think the food factor is a function of many things. Like, I think last year, even though we had our own economic crisis, we also saw global commodity prices going up and a lot of food items going up because a lot of plant nutrients, fertilizer that traditionally came from countries like Ukraine suddenly became blocked. So everything just went up in prices, and that had a knock-on effect on the supply chains, which meant that high prices were being imported for Sri Lanka.
Jivanta, from the banking side, how do you see it? Because you can, now the import-export side going on, and also we are looking especially with the food and vegetable area, the consumers, items that are affecting the consumers.
Yeah, Professor, yes, I think your answer is yes, because now when the Indian exporters invoice their exports to Sri Lanka in their local currency, which is INR, so basically they don't want to take into this dollar fluctuation factor into their pricing. So the exporters also can have a right pricing, and also the Sri Lankan importers also have a better pricing. So when the exchange rate INR US dollar is fluctuating happening now, we know that the INR dollar is basically INR is depreciating against dollar. But Indian export likes to have this benefit when they invoice in USD and getting US dollar Indian exports. But when they invoice in INR, they can actually avoid this factor in their pricing. So the Sri Lankan importers have a better pricing, at least they're lower than the US dollar pricing. So I think it's beneficial to our importers and essential goods in Sri Lanka, which are consuming.
Now, Shiran, how would it now? You see, now our local industry, how would this impact our local industry? Whether the competition that they are going to have will really result in maybe if it is coming at a cheaper price, whether they can improve their efficiency, or whether maybe they will come to a situation where they may have to really close down. How do you see the impact on the local industry?
I think if it's imported input, for example, raw materials or some machinery, things like that, I think that'll be, if it's coming at a lower cost, it'll be definitely beneficiary. If the finished good is coming at a lower cost, I think that's where the pressure will come in. But then, of course, the consumer also can determine the quality and the cost factor, right? So I think it's up to them as well. But I think that's why it's important to the biggest issue for, I think, local industries is our tariff structure, because Sri Lanka has a very complicated tariff structure. You have things like PAL, all of these which are not there. You have different cessors which are put in at different times to either protect industry or to safeguard interest and things like that. So, or from a revenue point of view. So I think that we need to sort out, and then whatever INR that comes in for intermediate goods, I think that will support local industry.
Actually, one area that I can look at, Dr. Vijayawardena, is the education industry. You see, because today we have maybe 45,000 students who are only taken to the government universities. Now, will this Indianization policy of convertibility result in maybe our students finding it is cheaper for them to go to India for education? They instead of maybe paying in dollars and other currencies, foreign currencies. And also there are so many universities that are there in India. Do you think that that will really benefit? Because we really need our students, and also if they go to India, you are quite sure that they will come back to Sri Lanka, but if they go to maybe the Australia and UK and other countries or USA, they are not coming back. So do you think that that would happen?
Well, right now, for us to get Indian rupees to spend in India, either you have to borrow US dollars and build up Indian rupee reserves in Sri Lanka. Otherwise, there is no surplus of Indian rupees available in the market, because what we pay to India is much more than what we receive. And if the tourism trade develops in Sri Lanka with a net inflow of tourists from India, who would spend, much more in Sri Lanka than any other tourist, we will be able to acquire these Indian rupees. So the expansion of to provide a cheaper method of making payments in India to our students who are visiting here, go back to the old problem of having reserve in Indian rupees, which has to be built up either by borrowing in US dollars and converted to Indian rupees, or directly from Indian banks, which has not been permitted by the central bank right now according to Jivanta, or getting a huge loan from the Indian government in order to finance it. So it comes to the same thing when it comes to spending money in India. It is just like our pilgrims who visit India spending in Indian rupees, because when they buy Indian rupees from Sri Lankan banks, if they don't have Sri Lankan Indian rupees, they cannot do it. And therefore, probably I think the margin which banks can collect from the people who in Sri Lanka who buy Indian rupees may become bigger. So that's also a very undesirable development.
Jivanta, how do you see it now from the banking side? Because whether you think there can be a shift to India with this acceptance of convertibility?
Yeah, Professor, now at the moment, the allowed transaction is trade transaction, that is the import and export. So we have not seen any student payments or TT settlement in INR yet. But I think when we have the more popularity in using INR, it will basically come into the banking system. They will make an INR payments. But I fully agree with the doctor also. But as long as we don't have much excess inflows for us to make payments, still we have to use this dollar and convert into INR, use this. So as long as we are getting inflows in terms of INR, we'll have to basically use this dollar payments itself.
Ruchira, there are some in the Q&A, and you may also be having some questions. Would you like to field to the speakers?
Yeah, Professor, now with the permission of Dr. Vijayawardena, because he has answered so many questions. So there is a question which I think would be beneficial for most of the viewers who are here. So with the permission of Dr. Vijayawardena, let me ask this question. Doctor, I think you may remember this question. This person is asking, will there be a possibility of Indian shareholders buying Sri Lankan companies through the Colombo Stock Exchange because of this development?
Well, I have answered this, but the
Yeah.
had been given by Jivant also.
Yeah.
If any Indian who wants to buy shares in the Colombo Stock Exchange, he has to do it in Sri Lanka rupee, because Indian rupee has not been accepted as legal tender by the central bank in Sri Lanka. So he will have to bring in Indian rupees, deposit it in a share trading external rupee account with the commercial bank in Sri Lanka. The Indian rupee will have to be converted to Sri Lanka rupee. So he is therefore facing the exchange rate risk between Indian rupee and the Sri Lanka rupee. And then he can buy it. I mean, it's not different from the arrangement that we already have. In the present arrangement also, anybody can bring in foreign currency, deposit in share trading external account with the commercial bank, convert it into local money, and then use that local money to buy shares in the stock exchange. So it's not different from the arrangement that we already have. And therefore, it doesn't make it easier for an Indian person to do it, because only advantage for him is, instead of transferring his money into dollars and then dollars back to Sri Lanka rupees, he will simply bring in Indian rupees and convert them to Sri Lanka rupees. But of course, again, the Sri Lankan banks may be charging this, horrendous commission from him when the money is converted to Sri Lanka rupee from Indian rupees. Same problem.
Correct. Thank you, Doctor. Ms.
Rupee,
Jivant, I would like to ask this question from you. Yeah, Professor, did you ask the question?
You can also permit Mr. Professor Kennedy there once you finish.
Yeah, Professor Kirandi, I haven't seen you. Sir, if you have any questions, you can raise the questions now.
No, go ahead. I didn't have any question. Sorry.
Okay. So this question is from Ms. Jivanta. Ms. Jivanta, now I would like to get your views on Indian rupees. Do you think that it will become a major global currency in the near future?
Ruchira, now presently also we have seen that RBI has given some approval, basically the 18 countries, to use INR as trading currency. And also we have seen some 35 countries also consider their, basically they are given consent in using INR as trading currency. So I think being a fifth largest economy in the world and expecting to become a third, I think India is basically playing a major role in the world. And basically there's a substitute to the dollar payments. And we have seen some restriction imposed by especially the US on some trading transaction with especially Russia and other countries. So basically they have to export and they have to import. The currency is not in terms of USD, but they'll have to use alternative currency. Generally they are using INR and CNI. Basically, so my personal view is, yes, there is a possibility, there is a chance of INR become a global currency in near future.
In the near future. Thank you very much. This question I would like to ask from Shiran. Shiran, in the future, do you think there could be potential international spillover effects on the Sri Lankan macroeconomic fundamentals?
Not in the short term. I think it'll only really gain traction if there is more usage of INR for trade settlement, and we build up INR reserves in that sense, and then we don't transact too much in dollars for some of these payments and inflows. Then only, I think, really you see a spillover effect. Maybe it's 2-3 years down the line once the adoption comes in.
Thank you, Shiran. Jivant, I think this question was answered by Dr. Vijayabhadrana, but anyway, since you're a banker, let me ask this question from you. This person is asking, when Sri Lankan shops accept Indian rupees, are they to convert in? I don't know whether it is allowed for Sri Lankan shops to accept Indian rupees. This person is asking, when Sri Lankan shops accept Indian rupees, are they to convert Indian rupees into LKR by using spot conversion? Or do they need to have an Indian rupee account with the bank or over-the-counter conversion?
Ruchira, we have seen some transaction in INR also. Basically, when the Indian traveler comes to Sri Lanka and basically if they want to convert into LKR, they can do it at the Bandar Naik International Airport.
No, can they do it? Can they do it in the shops? I think this person is asking whether they can do it in shops.
Yeah, generally when they go to hotels in Sri Lanka, also hotels are basically allowed to accept INR currency. So what happened is when the INR currency is accepting the hotels, they can open a bank account, BFC account with one of the commercial banks in Sri Lanka, and they can deposit there. So they can actually do it is allowed. So there is no any restriction anybody to accept INR currency, but we have seen not much circulation in INR acceptance so far in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Jivant. This question, and I have another question. This question has also come up in Q&A. This was answered by Dr. Vijayavardhana and also by Senior Professor Kendi Guruvardhana. The person is asking, unless the Indian tourism booms up, given there is a negative BOP, this mechanism will not work. So I would like to get your opinions on this. I can start with Dr. Vijayavardhana. Maybe Professor Kendi also can add to this.
Yeah, what matters to us right now is we are having a huge balance of payments problem in Sri Lanka, for which we had gone to IMF and got a bailout package. And that balance of payments problem has to be resolved by us in the medium to long term by improving productivity in Sri Lanka, by increasing the export of goods and services to the rest of the world, and by earning more foreign exchange than the foreign exchange that we are spending per annum, which means that we have to build up foreign exchange reserves through normal economic transactions and not by borrowing from the rest of the world. And that is exactly what the IMF bailout package also has, put into its terms and conditions till 2028. Whatever we borrow and, build up our reserves will not be counted as the building up of reserves in terms of the IMF bailout package. So this is something that we have to do apart from doing this type of, very, tinkering of the issues that we are facing. For that purpose, President Ranil Wickremesinghe has said that, he is going to arrange this, lab approach, which has been developed by the growth lab of the Center for International Development, CID, of Harvard University. And so far, that lab has not been formed by him. He had promised to form it by the end of the second quarter. Now we are into the second month of the third quarter. Still, the lab has not been formed. The lab report should have come to us by the end of this quarter. So these are things which Sri Lanka government has to do in collaboration with the private sector and also with the bureaucrats in the country by developing a suitable strategy to make Sri Lanka accessible to the rest of the world with the exportation of more goods and services than the importation of the same goods and services to Sri Lanka. So this comes from a different type of a strategy that has to be followed. We expect that President Ranil Wickremesinghe will soon go into this and, provide some relief to the country. Otherwise, other than that, because many of the questions raised by your viewers, participants had been based on that, whether Sri Lanka can, resolve its problem. No, we have to resolve our problems through the improvement of the real sector, not by providing facilities in the financial sector like this.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I also agree with Vijayavardhana, sir. Without a proper sound export policy, especially we need a very strong export policy to India. Otherwise, we can't do this transaction in a short run. I think we need a time for that. Even Indians who comes to Sri Lanka also, they are also not spending more. I think very minimum level we have seen that. I assume that I think we have a lot of opportunities, but not in a short run. Especially certain things we can produce, which Indians, really need, like agriculture products. Especially, India they can't produce such things, but we can. But in the other way also, imports are more. But anyway, if we have a good export plan, very high export plan to India, then definitely we can get more currency. But under this situation, I think it's impossible. That is what I think, my opinion.
Okay. Ms. Jivant, I would like to know from you, now given that Indian rupees are available with banks, will they be able to accept, will our banks accept Indian rupee LCs?
Ruchira, basically that is not relevant to the question which you asked, basically, even we are having Indian currency with banks, nothing to do with opening LCs. Basically, the supplier who is providing goods to Sri Lanka should have a consent of accepting INR currency in the final settlement. So then only we can open INR. But yes, if the supplier agrees to get their payment in INR, of course, we can open LCs in INR. That can be
INR
done.
LCs.
Yes.
So this question, this may be a bit political question. This question is asking, because of this arrangement, what will happen to our relationship with China and the USA? I would like to start with Dr. Vijayavardhana.
Well, of course, the global political scenario is always there for Sri Lanka to tackle, unless we have a very subtle approach to handling the diverse forces in the global political arena, like USA, India, China, because we have to take USA, EU, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan on one side, China on another side, and Russia on another side, India on the third side. So this is like, like an acrobat walking on a tightrope. And we already know Jayajawardena failed in 1980s by being very close to the Western forces and antagonizing the Indian politicians. And the result had been that India had been the major destabilizing factor in Sri Lanka's ethnic war. Similar thing can happen. I mean, if we antagonize China or if we antagonize the Western world by being very close to India, we are repeating what Jayajawardena did in 1980s. So this is a very subtle diplomatic move that we have to do. And unless we are very careful in handling our foreign affairs, we might get into a very bad situation in the future.
Professor Kennedy, would you like to add to that about the geopolitical balance? What will happen to the geopolitical situation because of this arrangement?
Yeah, I think that politically, I feel it's very risky. I'm not very good in the sense of explaining geopolitical situation.
Yeah.
But before that, I think we really need economic stability. But under this agreement, I don't feel in short run we have a solution. But in long run, if we have a good plan, good sound mechanism, I think we can get more advantage. But at the moment, I think we are in high risk situation. When we go with this agreement, I think we are in the further trouble. That's what, in my personal feeling.
Okay, thank you, sir. So one more question from my side. This question is on the dollar reserves. Now, this person is asking, because of this arrangement, will we face further problems when it comes to dollar reserves? Will our dollar reserves shrink further? Dr. Vijayavardhana?
Well, in the case of Sri Lanka, with our balance of payments problem, as I have already mentioned, the permanent solution to the balance of payments problem is an improvement in the real sector in Sri Lanka, improving our productivity, getting ourselves connected to the rest of the world with, joining the global supply chain network. And all these things will have to be done in order to resolve it. This type of, the arrangement that we do with a single country, even though that country is the largest trading partner of Sri Lanka, is simply, in my view, is tinkering the present problem, which will not provide the permanent solution. And as a result, it will not help Sri Lanka to come out of the current BOP crisis.
Correct. Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Shiran Fernando and also Mr. Jayavanta, would you like to add to this?
No, Richard, nothing specific, I think.
Jayavanta?
Not a specific, Richard.
Okay. Professor Kennedy, would you like to add to this?
No, go ahead. No, thank you.
Okay,
It's a very
okay.
interesting, very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Doctor. Professor, then I would like to end my questions from my side with this. Would you like to add any final comments?
Yeah, so let me thank everyone, actually, especially our speakers, because they've gone into the details of this new, maybe the convertibility, but I think everything has to start slowly, and then we have to see what impact it will have. Definitely, but of course, as I said, that of course what we came up is maybe what with other countries will also tell us, you accept our currency. Of course, maybe China might be one of the main parties who might come. So actually, I like to ask Dr. Vijayawardhan's view now. Supposing if we accept Chinese currency along with the Indian currency that is going on, would that really help our economy?
Well, we have the same problem, Professor Wattavala, because with China also we have an equivalent amount of trade deficit, about $3.5 billion US. So Mr. Jivanta will have to use his dollar balances to convert to renminbi and build up the nostro accounts with Chinese bank. So we are simply, Professor Wattavala, we are tinkering the issue rather than finding a permanent solution. So these are politically very, very attractive, but the solutions are fragile when we look at the long-term development requirements of the country.
Any final comments, Shiran and Jivanta?
No,
Shiran?
Professor, nothing from me. No.
No, yeah.
Thank you.
Jivanta, any final comments you want to make?
Professor, now the question you asked, CNY is also designated currencies approved by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. It is within the 16 currencies. Basically, with regard to the today's topic, we expect that for us to, so that our importers to popularly or at least to use this INR as a designated currency for the trade transaction, I think there have to be a very awareness program has to be very much conducted very soon. Otherwise, there won't be anything for us to get whatever the expected result in near future. So basically, they educate our importers to get their invoices in INR, and also the Indian exporters also should willing to accept their also the invoice their export to Sri Lanka in INR. Then only we can have a betterment of this convertibility of INR. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have had a very good discussion. So it is really a start that we are making. So I think from the discussion that we had, I'm sure that we will be able to develop this because we have had the banking side, we have the maybe the overall economy side that was given, plus also the trade and investment which is coming in. So as I think Jivanta has mentioned, we need to maybe tell maybe the people who are making use of this, because in order that this could be really used and benefited. But ultimately, I think as Dr. Vijayawardena mentioned, the Sri Lankan, maybe the industrialists, the service people, they need to really maybe get together and develop themselves on the productivity, increasing the exports, efficiency. I think all these need to come. Maybe the state organizations need to take up. Otherwise, as the governor has mentioned, we will have more and more DDOs coming in. So that's not what we really want to do. So we need to really see how the country can benefit, and definitely we all have to really work hard if this has to be maintained. So let me thank all our speakers and also all those participants for the very valuable contributions that you all have made. And let us maybe see whether this can also lead to many more things that could happen, and also people to make use of what has been given so that it would benefit the country. That's the most important thing. We have to really take that into account, how it will benefit our country. And I'm sure that what have been said today, we'd also have to be going to maybe many more seminars that can be had, so that people can be made to know, they can get more knowledge, they can get more activated so that this can be used. So let me also thank Ruchira for the wonderful way that he has conducted the webinar. And let me also thank our speakers and the participants for making this event a great success. Thank you and all the very best.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jayavardhana. Thank you, Jayavant. Thank you, Shiran. Thank you, Rajendra.